I'm Pastor Tom, and welcome to the Sunday Sermon.
You got to move. You gotta move. You got to move. You got to move. You got to move, child. You got to move. You gotta move. 'Cause when the Lord gets ready.
All right, I'm going to read to you now from the Gospel according to Luke in the 9th chapter. Jesus took Peter and John and James and went up to the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, his face became different. His clothing became white, gleaming with light. And there appeared two men talking with him. They were Moses and Elijah. They were appearing in glory. And they were speaking with Jesus about his departure, which he was to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now, as this was happening, Peter and his companions, they'd been drowsy with sleep, but they woke up and they saw his glory and the two men standing with him. And as they were leaving, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it's a good thing that we're here. Let us make 3 tabernacles, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah." He had no idea what he was saying. And in fact, while he was still saying this, a cloud formed, began to overshadow them. And they were afraid as they found themselves entering the cloud. And the voice came out from the cloud saying, "This is my son, my chosen one. Listen to him." Once the voice had spoken, there was Jesus alone. Well, they kept silent. They didn't tell this to anyone at that time. And it came about the next day that they came down from the mountain. They were met by a great multitude, and there was a man from the multitude shouting out and saying, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son. He's my only boy." And behold, a spirit seizes him, and suddenly he screams, and it throws him into convulsions, foaming at the mouth, and mauls at him, and it scarcely leaves him. And I begged your disciples to cast it out, and they couldn't do it. Every church I serve, there's always stories, back in the day. You know those stories? Right? Oh, when Pastor so-and-so was here, we used to do this or that or the other thing. The golden days of the church. And I refer to those pastors as the ghosts of pastors past. And I know I have been the ghost of pastors past at some churches. So it's not like you can blame the pastor for this. But also, when you think back to the glory days, I've learned you can't actually give the pastor all that much credit either. So I served 2 churches, a little bit like I do now. And one of them was a kind of like this, what I call a cornfield church. Yeah, church in a cornfield. The original version of the church actually looked a little bit like this one. Had a basement downstairs, upstairs sanctuary, and one day there was a terrible tornado, just awful. And the only church member who was injured was the one church member who hadn't come to church for the ice cream social. Everyone else who was in the basement of the church was just fine, even though the church above them completely disappeared. And so the church they rebuilt was all on a slab after that. But it was a lovely church and had great people. It actually had the best evangelists I ever knew were in that church. If you walked into that church, a stranger, just to kind of check things out, like here's a church, then they've got a church service. Let me go in and see what's going on. Before you left, they knew your name, they knew your address, and sometime later that afternoon, one of the saints of that church showed up with some freshly baked something for you, baked specifically for you that day. It was stunning to see them do this. If you walked into this church, everyone was related. They were all families. There were like basically four names in the family, and they were all related to each other. And if you came in as a stranger in that church, well, they didn't have time for strangers, so they had to adopt you, and you just became part of the family. It was remarkable. And this church grew. When I first got there, it had an average Sunday attendance of about 70, and when I left, it had an average Sunday attendance of 121. I know. And I'd be like, when I was pastor, right? Except I had another church Also a really lovely church. It was the church in town. And it was a neat church with really cool people in it. And when I started there, they had an average Sunday attendance running in the, I think it was mid to high 80s. And when I left, they had an average Sunday attendance down in the 70s. Same pastor, same sermon. I mean, I would go to one church, preach, I'd drive to the other one, preach, same thing, same hymns, everything. One church grew, one church it wasn't like crashing and burning, but it was declining. So I figured out really quickly that it wasn't me, which is probably a good thing for me to know, because otherwise I would have been walking around thinking I was God's gift to the church or something. It turns out that what was happening is this interesting constellation of events. So we had the church in the cornfield. It had these great evangelists in the church at that time. Also, it was just outside of Menominee, Wisconsin, and right on that end of town, a glass factory had been built, one of Cardinal Glass's factories, and they put in a Walmart distribution center, and so there was all of this new jobs and kind of industry that was growing. So a lot of people had moved in. So there were all these people moving in looking for a place to go to church, and they were checking out this little church in the cornfield. And when they got there, they were warmly received and welcomed. And so it was a constellation of events, local area population growth combined with good evangelists and, hopefully sermons that weren't boring, right? And so that's what happened. The other church was in a community that was not experiencing that kind of growth. And so the church was doing what churches do when there's no growth in the area. It was showing that decline, that kind of steady, slow decline, where you just don't have new people coming in all the time. So I learned that, okay, it's the interesting intersection of stuff. It just has to time out right. You have to be lucky. I mean, I saw that in one church. We had this amazingly huge music program for a while. We had like 60 or 70 people involved in the music program, between the choir, the praise band, the people who would play guitars with me when I did certain services, and also the ones who would do special music. I mean, it was like this huge bunch of people. I had huge confirmation classes then too, but then they got small real fast. And it turned out that what was going on that drove a lot of that was that there was this kind of population bubble. There was this really massive class of kids, sort of in that range of, they were within a 3-year period, but the bulk of them were all the same age. And so there's this massive class going through like this. And first they're in first and second grade, and then it's like second and third grade. And so they get up to me, and there's huge confirmation classes for a few years, and then it just drops down to just a handful. And the school had the same thing. The census at the school, the local high school, is like, what are we going to do with all these kids? And then, we should build. And the next year, it's like, okay, where'd the kids go? And so during that period of time, all those kids were coming to church. They were coming to, the youth group was happening. They were all, their parents made them go to confirmation class. So they were all in confirmation. So if they were going to confirmation class, I learned this really quickly. I've discovered that kids in confirmation class thought that was it. I actually had a conversation with a girl once. I was talking about the importance of going to church. I'm in class, and this girl looks at me, and she says, well, you don't mean like every Sunday, do you? And I said, do you have a boyfriend? And she said, yeah. I said, how often do you talk to your boyfriend? Well, every day. And I just looked at her, and she went, oh, I get it. But I learned that in order to really make that work, I had to start requiring my kids to show up in worship on Sunday, not just Wednesday night for confirmation. And they had to bring me a copy of the bulletin, which I signed. So they'd line up after service, and I would write my initials on there, and then they would go back and they put it in the confirmation room, and then we'd check them off, and they had to do X number of services they had to be present for. And I would tell them, it doesn't matter if it's here, you can go to any service anywhere. Just make sure the pastor signs. But suddenly I had all these kids. It was great. Had families in church. It was awesome. There's an old preacher's joke. I'm sure you've heard it. But it does describe what happened after that wave of people went through. It goes like this. There had been some flooding, and the flooding had caused the rats to escape the waters, and they had ended up going into the churches. And so now the churches had these huge rat problems in the middle of worship. Rats would run across people's feet. And it was just awful. And this group of pastors was talking about the situation. One pastor says, I don't know what to do. I put traps out everywhere, and I've tried every bait possible. Cheese, peanut butter, chocolate mousse, whipped cream, anything I could think of. And I come back in, and the cheese is gone, and the chocolate's gone, and the traps haven't even been tripped yet. And there are more rats. And the other pastor says, oh, I know what you mean. I got a couple of barn cats. I figured this will take care of them. And I put the barn cats in there, figured I'd come back. It was my day off, threw them in there. I'm going to come back on the next day after my day off, and that'll be it for the rats. The barn cats will have a pile of them. I came back, opened the door, and the barn cats came out, their tails between their legs. They were like, ooh, ratophobia. And the third pastor, who's been quiet up to this point, finally said, well, I don't have any problem with the rats. And the other two looked at him and said, what in the world did you do? He says, well, first I baptized them, then I confirmed them, and I haven't seen them since. Yeah, old preacher's joke. But here's what I learned. When those kids no longer have to be there for confirmation class, their parents stop coming too. So it wasn't about me. It was about this bubble going through at this time. And so I discovered that every single time something really amazing happens in my life as a pastor, it's not about me. It's about all this other stuff that just happened to be the coincidental things at that moment. So that later on I might think back of it and say, oh, in the good old days when I was there, it was like this. Or they may say that. You may say it. Do you have stories like that? I'm sure you do. Like, back in the good old days here in this church, when we used to do X, and it used to be full, and we'd have the dinner downstairs, and people would come from all over, and we got the stories. And you remember some pastor fondly, he or she was the one who was fortunate enough to be there at that moment. You're like, oh, and Pastor so-and-so, that was the best pastor we ever had. And that may or may not be true, but what is true is that was a great moment that was occurring. However, how often do we realize when we're in the middle of that moment that we're in the middle of one of those golden moments at those really precious places? I mean, probably back then at the time we were complaining that, man, all those people, they should be helping here in the kitchen. And it's just us six who've got to do everything, right? And that's how that usually works. But then years later, it's like, oh, back in the day, it was so great, right? So catching those moments is tricky stuff. Finding that is hard. Realizing that those things that have happened that were great and fantastic, that they didn't necessarily hang around. They were back then. They were fleeting. The circumstances change and the situation changes. And so sometimes you come to church and you're like, oh, if only. Let's try this again. We used to do this and it was really successful. Let's try this again. Here's what I've learned when we do that. Sometimes it works because you got people going, oh, I remember that when I was a kid. That's so wonderful. They're doing it again. I got to be there. And it works great. And other times it's like, well, now we know why we stopped doing it back then because it didn't work anymore and it's not working now. And then we have to figure out a new way, how to sing a new song to the Lord, some different way of being in the church. That's actually, by the way, how we get the mega churches today. That was an answer to a question. What's a different way of doing church? That question got asked in the late 60s and the 70s, something called the Jesus People movement or the Jesus Freak movement. And they were just doing a different way of doing church, mostly not in the Sunday sanctuaries, but mostly in youth group meetings and what are called parachurch organizations like Young Life, Campus Crusade for Christ, Fellowship of Christian Athletes. They were doing worship, but it was just a different style. And then those people grew up and they started migrating to these churches where that's what the worship service looks like. So when I look at here's the worship service, they say, well, we're going to sing a bunch of songs. Check. That's what we did it back in the day when I was in one of those youth group things. And then there's going to be a skit. Yep, we used to do skits all the time. And then there's going to be a sermon. Yep, we have a sermon. And then we're going to sing a couple more songs. Yep. And then we're going to gather for fellowship and whatever, eat or go out, have dinner at, Perkins or Cracker Barrel or something. In my day, it was Baker Square. Yep, check, check, check. Now it's a church. Then it was a movement. back in the glory days. But even the churches that have been very successful in terms of numbers and money right now, they're starting to already see the change that's coming. There's going to be a day when there'll be some big, huge mega church and it's kind of empty, and there'll be a group of people saying, back in the day, it was wonderful. So Jesus brings Peter and James and John up on the mountain. We learn that they're tired, just weary. You know how it is. Sometimes you just have a hard time staying awake. Hits me a couple times during the day, usually right about 9:30 at night and also about 3:30 in the afternoon. So if I happen to be watching TV at 9:30 at night, I might end up watching TV through the roof of my mouth. Right? So I totally get how they're feeling. They're like, oh man, I can't stay awake. This is so hard. And they're starting to doze off. And then suddenly something happens. And they're kind of forcing themselves awake because there's light. And Jesus' face is being transformed. It's shining with light. And his clothing is brilliant white, like puts off light in a way that's stunning. And then there's two more people there. Where did those guys come from? And they realize it's Elijah and it's Moses. And there's a cloud that envelops them. And a voice, this is my son, my chosen. Listen to him. And then it's over. Now, I would encourage you to look at the story. It's found, four descriptions of it in the Bible. It's in the three, what we call synoptic gospels. Pretty much the same in each one with little detailed changes. Then there's a reference to it in 1 Peter, 2 Peter, one of the two letters of Peter, where it talks about this. And also, I should say there's 5, because there's also another subtle reference to it in, it's a little less obvious, but it's in 1 John, that which we have seen with our eyes, which our hands have handled concerning the word of life. So you've got this sort of references to it elsewhere. But when you look at the story, you start to see a couple of things that you can really do some study on. Like, for example, there are two people who appear, Moses and Elijah. And their presence there invites you to start to think about certain things. So, for example, in the Gospel according to Mark, the presence of Elijah in particular is part of a motif that Mark is playing with, where he plays out Elijah the prophet and Elisha, who's the successor to Elijah. He plays out their storyline a little bit, where John the Baptist represents sort of the Elijah character and Jesus is the Elisha character. And he sort of connects the story that way. He does things designed to link it up to that great Old Testament tale of those two. Now, in the Gospel according to Matthew, you've got a little more sense of Jesus. Matthew likes to compare Jesus a little more with Moses, the lawgiver, and there's Moses right there. And so the idea that the presence of Moses and the presence of Elijah is kind of an affirmation of who Jesus is and what his purpose is. And it's really powerful stuff. You could start reading the Old Testament. What happens when Moses is around? He goes up onto the mountain and a cloud envelops the mountain and a voice speaks to him and gives him the commandments. Similarly, if you read the story of Elijah, Elijah goes up to a different mountain, but it's still a mountain. And when he gets up there, a cloud surrounds him, a storm surrounds him, and it's the presence of God, and God speaks to him from that place. And so you see, there's just really intentional, powerful connections. And when you say the words, so we think of the Hebrew Bible, what we call Old Testament. It's got 3 parts, basically 3 kinds of literature. So it's actually referred to that way. You have the law, or the first 5 books, the books of Moses, they're called the Torah. Then you've got the prophets, and then you've got what are called the writings. So the writings are things like Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. And those are the 3 general categories. So in modern lingo, if you're talking to someone about the Hebrew Bible, if you're talking to someone who's Jewish, refer to it as the Tanakh. The T is for Torah, and the N is for the Hebrew word for prophet, and the K is for the Hebrew word for writings, Tanakh. But also, it was a very common shorthand throughout the ages to just refer to the teachings of what we call Hebrew Scriptures as the teachings of the law and the prophets. The law and the prophets. Well, there you've got Moses, the representative of the law, the commandments, and there you've got the prophet Elijah representing the work of all the prophets. The law and the prophets, this connection to the Old Testament, really strong. So, have fun, go look at that. However, oh, by the way, there's a whole other issue, because Peter, what does Peter do? He's like clearing the sleep from his eye, trying to figure out what's going on, and he sees the Elijah and Moses are getting ready to leave. He says, we'll make tents, they can have a sleepover. Which, by the way, is an intentional and specific reference to one of the Old Testament feast days. You can go look that up and study it. And you'll see all of these great connections. You see how this is just deeply embedded in that Israelite, Hebrew, Jewish world that comes to us in the Hebrew Scriptures. But what fascinates me is something else. When I look at the story, what fascinates me is the human experience that Peter and James and John have. They're just going through it, right? They're just doing their thing. They're following their Jesus as best they can. They come up there on the mountain. We come up to pray. They're falling asleep, which says something about how good they are at praying. And then this remarkable, unexpected, powerful thing happens. It's amazing. It's just incredible. It's that mountaintop experience, right? Have you ever gone on a spiritual retreat or a spiritual weekend event? Something like Walk to Emmaus or something like that? Confirmation retreat? Or even just like to some kind of revival meeting where it's just so powerful and meaningful and you feel this incredible presence of God. I went and hung out just a little bit with some Catholic charismatics back in the day. And man, it was just amazing. Just the power and the presence was so huge. And, I think about those experiences. They're just enormous experiences of faith. And then they're over. And the next day, it's like you get depressed. Because you're like, I'm on the mountaintop. And the next day, what's wrong with me? But look at this story. Look at this story. They're on the mountaintop. There's glory. They see Jesus transfigured. They hear the voice of God, for crying out loud. They're overwhelmed. And then they come down the mountain, and the first thing they're met with is a problem. I asked your disciples to heal him, and they couldn't. It's like, what? Everything changed. Nothing changed. Back to the grind. I don't get it. I like that mountain. I don't like this. I want to go back and just have those kinds of experiences. But they didn't see it coming. They didn't realize it was happening until it was almost too late when they opened their eyes and went, oh my goodness. And then Peter with his let's do tents. He's trying to hold on to the experience. Can we keep doing this so it doesn't get away from us? Can we hold on to it? He's trying really hard. He can't hold on to it. And so in the end, what are those guys, Peter, James, and John, what are they left with? They've had this amazing experience of power and glory, and then it's back to the grind. But what are they left with when the cloud is gone, when the prophet is gone, when Moses is gone? What is left for them? Jesus. That's what's left. That's who's left. Because it was always about Jesus anyway. And that's all they really needed was Jesus. And it's important for us, I think, to remember that both in our personal lives and as a church. But there are going to be the times that are just wonderful and they're full of life and they're fantastic. And there'll be the times when we'll be like, oh, these are the golden days. Usually we'll think of that afterwards, but there'll be the golden days. And then it will be those times where we feel like we're struggling. Like, wait, are we going to die? Can we survive? But even when all the glory is gone, Jesus remains. And that is enough. Can you find the prayer of response there printed in the bulletin? And please stand. We will pray that together. Weary and tired, I glimpse through heavy eyes a transcendent glory, a joy, a blessing, an unexpected season of grace which catches me by surprise. And even as I shake myself awake and reach for it, Lord, already it is beginning to fade. Like Peter, I try to hold on to that glory, to keep it with me, to make it last. But soon it is gone. But when it is gone, Jesus remains. So I discover what I have always known. Jesus alone is sufficient. Amen. We'd love to have you join us for Sunday worship at 8:30 at the Christ United Methodist Church or 10:15 at the Stanton United Methodist Church. Until next time, may the Lord God bless you and keep you. May the face of the Almighty be upon you, and may God grant you peace.
When the Lord gets ready, you got to move. Oh, you got to